All right, class, today's lesson is about factoring trinomials where a is equal to 1. Now, before we go to our examples, let's look at the steps that we're going to follow in order to factor these trinomials. Step 1 says that we're going to set up our x. Setting up our x is basically saying that we're going to draw a large x. We're going to then identify the coefficient, which is the a, b, and c, from the quadratic, which has a template that we follow, which is ax squared plus bx plus c. Then step 2 says we're going to multiply the a times x. What that means is we're going to multiply the leading coefficient of the a by the constant c, and we're going to place that at the top of the x, okay? Then step 3 says we're going to place b. Now we're going to place the coefficient of the middle term, which is the bx part, at the bottom of the x, all right? Step 4 says that we're going to then find the numbers. We have to find two numbers that multiply to be the top of the x, and also either add or subtract to be the bottom of the x, which is the b part, okay? Now, we also got to remember that when we fill in this x, we got to keep the signs that are attached to the numbers with them, okay, at the top and bottom. Then step 5 says we're going to set up our factors. We're going to set up the factors as fractions. And when we set up these factors as fractions, basically if we take whatever we get for the first number, we're going to put it over a, and whatever we get for the other number, we're going to also put that over a. That gives us the fractions that we need. Now, once we get those fractions, the next thing we have to do is simplify. Now, when we simplify the fractions, that means getting it to the smallest term that we can possibly get it to. And then the last step is called bottoms up. Now, this one actually gives us our answer once we follow that step. Bottoms up basically says that we're going to take the denominator and move it to the front of the x, okay? And then the numerator is going to go behind the x, but we got to make sure that we keep the sign with it because we are setting up two binomials. And with those binomials, you have an x, you have signs encased in two sets of parentheses, okay? So now that we have our steps, now let's go and look at our examples. All right, so let's look at example 1. In example 1, we got the factor x squared plus x minus 12. Now, when we start this problem out, we need to go ahead and identify what our a, b, and c is going to be. That's step 1. And then we'll draw a large x. So in this one, because there's no number beside the x squared, we're going to say a is 1. There's no number shown right beside the middle term, which will be our b, so that's also going to be a 1. And then the c term in this one is a negative 12. So after we identify a, b, and c, the next thing we do is we draw x. So in our x, after we get that drawn, we need to multiply our a times our c. So a times c, which in this one is 1 times negative 12, which is negative 12, goes to the top of our x. And then at the bottom of the x will be our b term, which is a positive 1. Now that we have our x set up, we need to find two numbers that can multiply to be the top, which is negative 12, and then add or subtract to be positive 1. So in order to do that, what we have to do is find all of the times tables of 12. So if we go through that, we know we got 1 times 12, we got 2 times 6, and 3 times 4. Now with those, we need to see which one we can either add or subtract to give us 1. So we're going to set up a little table right beside our factors. One column is going to be positive, the other column is going to be minus. So if I add 1 times 12, that's going to give me 13. If I subtract 1 and 12, that's going to give me 11. If I add 2 and 6, that's going to give me 8. If I subtract it, that'll give me 4. If I add 3 and 4, that'll give me 7. If I subtract it, it'll give me 1. Now, when we look at that table, the one that gave me what I needed, which is a 1, was 3 and 4. So now I'm going to put 3 over here and 4, okay? Now, when we multiply this, we have to pay attention that we need a negative 12, but also a positive 1. Now, this part is important because it's the signs. We knew that we had to subtract to get 1, but we also need a positive 1. So that means that your larger number will need to be the positive in this case. So I'm going to put a plus in front of the 4 and then a minus in front of the 3. Now it says we're going to set up our factor as a fraction. So underneath both of my factors, I'm going to put the a term, which is 1. Now, anything over 1 is already simplified. So that means we don't have to make the fractions smaller than what they are this time. But now we're going to do the last step, which is called bottoms up. And it says you take the bottom or the denominator of the fraction, you put it in front of the x. So I'm going to put 1x. So I put the 1 in front of the x. And then I put the numerator behind the x, which is a -3. And I can close that one. Now I do the other one. The other one says the same thing. We put the 1 out front of the x. And the numerator goes behind the x. So that means when we finish solving these, the two factor, when it is factored completely, will be 1x minus 3 and 1x plus 4. Now, it's not going to be written with the 1 in front. So we got to remember that when we actually see these, they're just going to be x minus 3 and x plus 4. All right, so now that is example 1 fully factored. Now let's move to example 2. All right, so let's move to example 2. It says in example 2, we have to factor x squared minus 5x minus 24. Now, in order to start that, we got to list out what our a, b, and c will be for the problem. So our a in this problem is 1. Our b is -5. And our c is -24. Now we can go ahead and set up our x. Now once we get our x drawn, we can go ahead and multiply our a times c, which in this one will be 1 times -24, which is -24. Now that will go at the top of our x. Now once we have that, we can go ahead and put the number that we need at the bottom, which is the b term, which is -5. All right, now that we have our x set up, we can go ahead and find the factors that will give me 24. Now this is all the times tables that I need for 24, like 1 times 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8, and 4 times 6, okay? Now once we get all our factors of 24, we're going to make our columns with the plus and the minus. So we can see which one will give us the -5 or 5 that we need. Okay, so if I add 1 and 24, that's 25. If I subtract it, that's 23. If I add 2 and 12, that's 14. If I subtract it, that's 10. If I add 3 and 8, that's 11. But if I subtract it, that's going to be 5. And then if I add 4 and 6, that's going to be 10. And then if I subtract it, that will be 2. Now we needed 5, okay? The only one that gave me 5 was 3 and 8. So I'm going to put 3 and 8 here. Now we need whatever we put for 3 and 8, we needed to give us a -24, but also give us a -5 when we multiplied, give -24, it got to be subtracted to give us -5, okay? So with that being said, this time we're going to put a negative in front of the bigger number, and the smaller number is going to be a positive. If I multiply -8 times 3, that gives me -24. If I have -8 plus 3, that gives me -5, okay? So now we're going to take whatever the a term is, put it at the bottom of each one of our factors. We're going to then simplify, but because 1 is already at the smallest term, we don't have to make it any smaller. Now we can go ahead and write our two binomials. Bottoms up, meaning the number at the bottom of the fraction goes in front of the x, and the number at the top of the fraction goes behind the x. Okay, and then the other one, we got the bottom number of the fraction goes in front of the x, and what's at the top of the fraction goes behind the x. So that will be the two binomials. Once we factor example 2 completely, we get x plus 3, and we get x minus 8. All right, so now that we finished example 2, let's move to our last example. All right, so let's move to our last example that we're going to complete for these notes. Example 3 says we need to factor x squared minus 8x plus 15. Now, in order to do that, we're going to go ahead and label our A, B, and C. So our A in this one is 1. Our B is -8. And our C is +15. Now, once we get that, we can go ahead and draw our big X. And we can go ahead and multiply our A times C. So A times C, which will be 1 times 15, which is 15. So that goes to the top of my X. At the bottom of my X will be my B term, which is a -8. Now that I have that, I can go ahead and find everything that I can get that will multiply to be 15. So that's going to be 1 times 15 and 3 times 5. Okay. Now we need to see which one of those factors can add to be -8 or subtract to be -8. So set up my two columns. I got a plus column, minus. So if I add 15 and 1, that gives me 16. If I subtract them, that gives me 14. If I do 3 and 5 and I add them, that gives me 8. And if I add them, it gives me 8. If I subtract them, that gives me 2. Okay. Now the only one that gave me 8 was 3 and 5. So I'm going to put my 3 and my 5 here on the sides of my X. Now I have to remember that I need a +15. But it also has to add or subtract to give me a -8. So now this part here is a little tricky because you got to make sure your signs are right. So in this case, because the top number is positive and the bottom number is negative, my two factors will be negative. Because if I multiply -3 times -5, that's +15. But if I add -3 and -5, that's -8. Okay? Then I'm going to put my A term at the bottom, simplify if I can, but because it's 1 at the bottom, that means it's already in the simplest form it was going to be. Now we do bottoms up, meaning the bottom term goes in front of the X, and the top term of the fraction will go behind the X. And then for the other side, we got the bottom term is in front of the X, and behind the X will be the top term. So for example 3, we're looking at it being X minus 3 and X minus 5. Okay, now that we completed example 3, this is everything that we need to know about how to factor trinomials when A is equal to 1. But one thing I do want to give before we close these notes out is some helpful hints. Okay, now these helpful hints are important for when it comes to factoring, because it's going to basically show when I have this set up for my X, these are the signs that I need to have for my two factors. Now this is just something to keep in your notes, but if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.